Welcome to Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at Aristotle. Book 4 of the Ethics really concerns Aristotle's discussion of justice. Now, make sure you've taken a look at the previous videos so you have a sense of what Aristotle's already talked about. As a virtue theorist, he ultimately thinks that the best form of life, the way to achieve happiness, is to cultivate proper and excellent character traits. In other words, to cultivate virtue. Now, there are different virtues. He defines a virtue, again, just by summary, as the mean between an excess and deficiency. So the virtue is always an intermediate at some point. And we saw in the previous book 4 here, Aristotle discussed a whole bunch of different virtues. Ones which may not be at the top of the list for most of us, but he was essentially explicating and demonstrating the way in which he recognizes the structure of justice as being this mean between excess and deficiency. Now, justice is one of the penultimate virtues we'll see for Aristotle, and it is so important that he devotes really an entire book to it, an entire discussion. So we'll start off here with Aristotle starts off here with the recognition that there are varieties of justice. He writes, quote, all men, let me make that bigger. He says, all men mean by justice that kind of state which makes people disposed to do what is just and makes them act justly and wish for what is just, and similarly by injustice, that state which makes them act unjustly and wish for what is unjust. So, you can see here, what I really want to focus on, you can see I've highlighted here, is the notion that for Aristotle, again, to have the character trait of justice is to occupy a kind of state, a state of being, in which you're disposed to do just things and to act justly. Now, you can see there, he hasn't started off by defining justice per se. There is a degree to which, because of Aristotle's methodology, sociological almost, he's looking at how justice is used, how justice exists in his own society, as well as in the other societies he's aware of and he knows of. So he's already operating with what we might call as our common conception of justice. It's also highly informed because the Platonic school, of which Aristotle was a member, before he really broke off, justice is a central discussion. So there's a lot of, these remarks here, Aristotle's beginning one way, he hasn't really offered an exhaustive treatment yet of justice. Now there's a sort of small aside that he makes here, and that's the notion that the sciences deal with contraries, but a state of character is one of two contraries. It does not produce the contrary results. So for example, as a result of health, we do not do what is the opposite of healthy, but only what is healthy. In the same manner, you have the distinction between things which are just and things which are unjust. What Aristotle is talking about here, when he talks about the contraries, is the recognition that some things are generated out of their contraries. And what he wants to argue is that this is not the case for, really, I think, for the virtues, but certainly not the case for justice. He also notes that it's possible to discriminate contrary conditions of character. So we can recognize that there are parts of our characters which are just and other parts which are unjust, but the contrary relationship between the unjust and the just is not the same as that between, let's say, hot and cold, right? You can't have hot without cold and vice versa. And Aristotle seems to suggest that you don't generate justice out of injustice, even though you can discriminate these contrary conditions within character. He says if the one is vague or ambiguous, then the contrary will also be vague or ambiguous. So, so justice depends to a certain degree on what character traits are recognized and so on and so forth, recognizing those contraries. So he sort of goes off on the side, which Aristotle is likely to, he tends to always do, is go off on small tangents, so it's not uncommon. So don't feel bad if you do the same thing. Now, he also makes this distinction, though. He says that the contrary between the just and the unjust is ambiguous, though, right? Where the just seems to be aligned with, one way of splicing the distinction would be to say that the just is aligned with that which is lawful, and the unjust is aligned with that which is unlawful. So that's one way in which we can distinguish it. But it's also very clear, and you'll see that as the chapter continues, or as the book 5 continues, Aristotle begins to tighten up his discussion here, and he's trying to get at really the problem of recognizing, because another way to think about it is we can also imagine people who act justly but break the law, right? We can also imagine people who act unjustly but act in accordance with the law. So the distinction or the contrary relationship between the unjust and the just is not exactly clear. He says that, there's different ways of looking at justice. On the one hand, we think of justice as a complete excellence, not absolutely, but in relation to others. So justice is a complete virtue, but it's not a complete virtue in an absolute sense. It's always a complete virtue or a virtue in terms of its relationship with others. So that means that justice, for Aristotle's perspective, fundamentally requires that we have relationships with other people. So without that ingredient of the other, justice doesn't manifest itself. And here's a little quote we can read here. Aristotle writes, or says, and therefore justice is often thought to be the greatest of excellences, or greatest of virtues, and neither the evening nor morning star is so wonderful, and proverbially, in justice is every excellence comprehended. So there is this other notion, too, that justice is a complete excellence, insofar as to have justice in the full sense, you must also have a whole variety of other excellencies at play. So justice is a penultimate virtue, I believe, for Aristotle, partially because its manifestation requires a whole range of virtues already at play. And so it's complete in that sense. It's also complete in the final sense because remember the goal for Aristotle is ultimately political science and social existence. And justice is the virtue of the excellent that is closely associated with that. Now that means that we can make a distinction here between justice, what we might call general justice versus special justice. And here the question is, but what is the justice that is a part of every excellence or virtue, right? So for Aristotle, he recognizes that to act honestly is also to act justly, for instance. So how can we distinguish the notion of the complete general sense of justice as a virtue versus the particular forms of justice within the other virtues? So there seems to be two types of justices, if you will, right? Justice as an excellence in its entirety, and then there's justice, which is a part of another excellence or part of a virtue. So there seems to be sort of two different ways we can splice the equation. Now, he also asks us to consider the differences of vice, right? So he gives us two different cases. So for instance, on the one hand, imagine you have an adulterer who makes money. That is, they receive gain for acting wrongly. I can't really imagine a scenario in which that would be the case, but imagine, I guess someone pays someone else to, engage, have intimate contact with them, right? So the adulterer who makes money, they receive gain. And the other person is the adulterer who loses money, but who acts out of self-indulgence and appetite. Which one is worse, right? So on the case one, you have a sort of odd case in which someone is being paid to commit adultery. And in the second case, you have a person who commits adultery but loses money, right? But they acted merely out of self-indulgence and appetite, right? They just had lustful desires and then they committed adultery. Who's worse? Well, in case one, it seems like we have a case of injustice because we have a case in which someone is receiving gain for acting wrongly. And in case two, we really just, not so much injustice, but we have here as a moral vice. So that's one way to start to splice out the difference between justice within the virtues. And this means that there appears to be multiple forms of justice, right? So the unjust has been divided into the unlawful and the unequal, and the just into the lawful and the equal. And so we have this distinction of Aristotle's, and this is the distinction between particular justice and particular injustice versus justice in the full sense and the unjust in the full sense. So it seems to be, and we have to be a little bit careful to place too much emphasis on the English words here, but it looks like he keeps the notion of injustice to talk about the particularity of unjust acts. And a person who's unjust is the state of being in which a person is not disposed towards justice, but rather towards the vice of justice. So we have this distinction between ultimately that which is particular and that which is universal, you might say. He doesn't quite say that, so maybe that's not right. Maybe you could say it's the distinction between the particular and the general. I think he would prefer that language there because he uses the language of genus and species when he starts talking about this stuff. Now, One part of particular justice concerns the distribution of goods. This is what we call distributive justice, and he actually has a whole section on this coming up here, so I won't go into that too much detail. But particular justice is about this or that scenario, this or that relationship that two people have with each other or multiple people have with each other. And one way of thinking about that particularity concerns the distribution of things, right? And here Aristotle introduces, and he's already mentioned it, but an important distinction. You can have the voluntary distributions of goods, voluntary justice, and you can also have involuntary distribution of goods, right? So of the voluntary, you think talking about things like sales, purchases, usury, pledging, lending, and so forth. But in terms of the involuntary, you can have a clandestine distribution of goods in which people steal from each other, they commit adultery, there's poisoning, enticement of slaves, and so on and so forth. One of the things I find that's interesting here is that when Aristotle looks at voluntary distribution, he mainly thinks in terms of economics, which makes sense because it's the distribution of goods that economics is concerned with. But when he thinks of the voluntary, he mainly thinks of selling things. They're all either neutral or positive terms. But when he talks about the involuntary, it's interesting because Aristotle doesn't give us neutral examples of involuntary distribution of justice. But I think an example of this would it be taxes? And I don't know, because obviously the law is created by people voluntarily. But it seems to me that when people are forced to pay taxes, that also is a distribution of goods, which is involuntary, at least involuntary insofar as if people want to remain citizens within a society. So it seems to me there's a way of maybe talking about taxes here, but he doesn't do it. But he does then go into a greater discussion of distributive justice in particular. Now, distributive justice, we can just say, is that part of justice which is concerned with the distribution of things and persons, right? Now, the just will be the intermediate between the more or less of equal distribution. Now, ultimately what Aristotle sees here is he thinks that, because notice here I mentioned earlier that his notion is that our relationship to others is critical to our thinking about justice. And he follows through with this by laying out what he calls the four terms of justice. That is, in justice, you seem to have always a relationship, at least structurally, between two persons and then in relationship to two objects. So you seem to have these four terms: person A, person B, object C, and object D. And his notion here, and you can see he's very much informed from the Platonic school and the early Greek thinking, especially the Pythagoreans, I think here, because he immediately goes to a mathematical relations here, right? He does mention that we'll see that mathematical relations in a moment, but he does say that the relation is partially determined by merit, that is, figuring out what one deserves and what one does not deserve, and so on and so forth. And you can think here about the justice, for instance, of being paid fairly, right? So if you work let's say you work at a restaurant somewhere, right? You have a relationship between yourself and the owner, and then between their capital and your paycheck, right? And there is a relationship in which you're treated equally by those terms, but to be treated justly, but it's always according and determined by the merit, how long you worked, how good of a job you did, the contract, whatever, right? The problem, though, is that how we determine merit is completely disagreed upon. So he says, for instance, democracy seems to treat merit, is concerned with merit insofar as it concerns the free men, right, and the multitude of people, or freedom, you might say. Oligarchy gets concerned with wealth, and in aristocracy, merit concerns excellence or virtue itself. So Aristotle ultimately believes in aristocracy. But then he goes in to discuss the proportionate nature of justice, and here he thinks that they're geometrically proportionate, and proportion for him always concerns the equality of ratios. So we can imagine a sort of square like this. Now, Aristotle lays it out. He goes from A to B and from B to D. And I don't know, I hope that I've, reconstructed the diagram the way he would have seen it, but this is the way I understand it. Is you can say that A and B are persons and C and D are objects. And there's always an equality of relationship between them, however that gets determined by merit. You could also say there's probably could be diagonal lines here as well, right? And you can say that what the unjust is the unjust is what violates the proportion, right? And so what happens when justice violates the proportion? Well, for Aristotle, this is when we have to turn to rectificatory justice, the notion of rectifying injustice, right? Sometimes it's not the same thing, but you also see in modern discussions of justice the notion of retributive justice, that is giving retribution to people, right, who commit crimes and this sort of thing. Aristotle doesn't use the notion of retribution because the goal of justice isn't to punish for punishment's sake, or to punish the person as such, but the goal of justice is to rectify the breach of proportionate equality, right? That's what injustice does, is it breaks the proportionate bonds that we have with other people. And so that's why you want to talk about justice in terms of it rectifying the loss of equality, right? Because the just concerns equality and the unjust concerns inequality. Now, he does make a distinction to talk a lot about here, is the notion that ultimately the just is aligned with the law, not with the ruler, right? The law treats parties as equal. So even if someone is of greater rank, status, or income than myself, right, but I have a dispute with them, the whole notion, and I think I've been wronged by another person, for instance, such that we no longer are being treated equally, then I go to the law and the judge adjudicates this. And Aristotle's notion is that, quote, the judge tries to equalize things by means of a penalty, by taking away from the gain of the assailant. So if someone wrongs me financially and I go to civil court, then I may get money from the other person, right? This is the notion of trying to balance the scales of justice. That's where this image comes from, really. Right? And this is why in matters of dispute, a judge is always sought and treated as an intermediate. Now notice that insofar as justice is a virtue, it is the intermediate state between excess and deficiency. In the same manner, the judge occupies an intermediate position between, I guess, the assailant and the victim. Right? So it's sort of interesting. You can see here how Aristotle's thinking on justice is really ruled by a sort of overriding tendency towards consistency, right? He says, quote, the equal is intermediate between the greater and lesser according to arithmetical proportion, right? So the just is intermediate between a sort of gain and a sort of loss. Now, of course, the difficulty there is some crimes that are committed, some injuries cannot be, you can't, like if a person is raped, for instance, rectifying that becomes very, very difficult. Like, do you have the other person raped? That doesn't seem right. Typically, that's not what we do in justice. What we do is we usually take away their freedom to do other things, right? So that means that the rectification of injuries happens in a multitude of ways, and it depends upon merit and circumstances and capacity and all sorts of things, right? A person who gets murdered can't be rectified. Right now, frequently what does happen is that if a murderer will be imprisoned, or they themselves will lose their life. So you see, things don't get rectified for the individual, the victim in the case of a murder, but they do. But there is a sort of rectificatory procedure. Sorry, I can't talk this morning. Anyway, let's keep going here. Okay, so this brings us to the question of justice in exchange, what we might think of as economic justice for Aristotle. Though he doesn't merely think of economic justice, he does think about that, but he also, let's just go through it, right? Some think that justice is simply about having reciprocality, right? Reciprocal relations. This is the notion of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, this sort of things. And this is what the Pythagoreans held, is that ultimately, this is what all justice was. This is not Aristotle's view, mind you. Aristotle's view is that justice is an excellence and a virtue, right? But it has to do with this. But he does recognize that when we talk about associations of exchange, reciprocal justice is what seems to bind the community. So at the core of economic justice, you might say, is a sort of reciprocality, right? Now, reciprocity has to be in accordance with proportion, right? Because remember, his notion is that justice is this mathematical proportion. And so reciprocity is clearly linked with this, right? And so Aristotle gives the builder shoemaker example. And here I'm going to read it to you because it's a little bit long. And you can, if you want, you can join me. It's 1133a8 is where this is. I should have already had this ready. Okay, so here's what Aristotle says. To give an example, this sort of ties it all together. He says, now proportionate return is secured by cross-conjunction. Let A be the builder. Let A be a builder, B a shoemaker, C a house, and D a shoe. The builder then must get from the shoemaker the latter's work, and must himself give in return his own. If then the first is proportionate equality of goods, and then reciprocal action takes place, the result we mentioned will be affected. But if not, the bargain is not equal and does not hold, for there is nothing to prevent the work of the one being better than that of the other. They must therefore be equated. And so he goes on. So you can see he takes that same example we had before, that diagram, the A, B, C, D, and he plug and plays into it this notion of exchange. So he's really trying to make a strong case here for a mathematical basis, really, in the justice that concerns exchange. Right? Bargains must be reciprocally equal, and without reciprocity, there can be no association of parties. And you can imagine here, if you have different businesses, but the businesses, there is no guarantee of reciprocity between them, then they can't associate ultimately, because what happens is they would just be taken advantage of. They would lose all their shoes, they would lose all the houses, and so on and so forth. So you have to have reciprocity at the basis if you're going to have an association of parties. You can see this is a sort of sociological, social political point for him as well, because he's trying to think through how in a civil society you have a multitude of associations, groups, and how do those groups relate to each other. And he's thinking about it in the most basic sense in terms of the economic distribution of goods themselves. Now this therefore leads us into his discussion of political justice. Okay, and he said the first thing to note here for Aristotle is that people can act justly but not be unjust people. So, for example, someone who commits adultery out of passion is the example he gives. And he says this is a case where someone acts unjustly, but that doesn't mean that the person themselves is an unjust person, right? Because they acted out of incontinent self-indulgence or appetite or something like this, right? So that means that we have a problem on our hands, which is namely that we can have just people who occasionally commit unjust acts. Now that creates a problem because that means that ultimately justice can't be simply left to the individual. So this leads us, right, you can see where he's going here towards political justice and the idea of what you might call as legal justice, right? He says, quote, justice exists only between men whose mutual relations are governed by law, and law exists for men between whom there is injustice, for legal justice is the discrimination of the just and the unjust. Now, it's really important here for Aristotle to articulate and emphasize that ultimately the law is what governs a polis, a political community, not a single person. And for the very obvious and simple reason that a single person will naturally start to emphasize and concern themselves with matters that are related to their own self-interest, and then eventually they become a sort of tyrant. So it's really important that it's the law that governs men, not people who govern, right? So you have this. So there is a distinction here between what Aristotle calls political justice, which is the justice concerning with the laws, and household justice, which is really the sort of justice he imagined, what you might call as private justice, how you treat each other, how we treat each other in our own daily affairs, in respects of keeping our promises and things like that, and treating each other equally. You loan me some money, I make sure I pay you back, and so on and so forth. Now, in political justice, the law is what rules over the ruled, and so therefore the justice and injustice of the citizens is not actually manifest in social relations. So this means that the way in which I treat myself in a public political sense, since it's governed by the law, I don't actually have to voluntarily, I just have to conform to the law. I don't rather have to voluntarily act in a way that is justice in the positive sense, right? Which means that me just following the law doesn't reveal a strong character, a just character, right? Rather, in household justice, the justice or the injustice of a person is what is made manifest. Now, Aristotle doesn't say this, But to me, this seems to be similar to the distinction we have between criminal and civil justice. So in criminal justice, the state is who charges you. In civil justice, in sort of civil court, it's other people who charge other people. So now we have to be careful because civil justice is also ruled by the law too. Because in Aristotle's day, household justice would have been purely private affair in terms of what you do to your own property and your own household. Now that's not quite as I don't think that's really quite the case today, at least not in the Western world. The contemporary, let's say the industrial world, the industrialized world. Okay, this brings us to number 7. Aristotle, and I don't have a lot of points on this because Aristotle just raises the distinction really in this section. And there's this notion that you can distinguish that justice by nature versus justice by law. And here's a couple things. Now, on the one hand, let's go back here. On the one hand, you see we can have justice according to natural law or natural precept. That is, there appears to be certain things. Well, Aristotle gives the example, in nature, some things are stronger than other things, right? I think he gives the example of one arm could be stronger than another, or something like this. And so there's natural conditions there are certain conditions and there's certain, characteristics of who we are and how we interact with each other socially that are consequence of our natural condition. And so this leads into a discussion of natural justice or natural law. By contrast, you can think of justice by convention or justice that's the result of human enactment, right, is something different, right? The difference is that justice by nature is going to appear uniform and universal, whereas justice by convention or justice by human enactment appears plural and diverse. That is, it looks different in different ways. So for instance, I think an example of this might be that the prohibition against murder probably would be based upon a conception of natural precept or something. That's debatable. He doesn't give that example, but it seems to be universal and uniform condition for every society. Whereas, for instance, particular laws, for instance, a punishment about, let's say, for instance, someone crosses the street without asking and then they get a ticket, or crosses the street on a red light and then they get a ticket. In some cities they don't give tickets for jaywalking. So this appears to be diverse, plural, and simply the result of convention and human enactment, right? Something that's particularized and localized to a specific city. So there is this distinction he's playing with and thinking about here in the background. And of course, that's an important distinction insofar as, regardless of what you think about it, clearly justice in the conventional sense must have certain human animalistic conditions, right? That is, certain natural conditions for it to exist. Now, point A here is that he begins to discuss the distinction between the justice, injustice, and the voluntary, right? So, for instance, just acts always require a condition of voluntary action. So, in order for me to act justly, I have to actually be in control of what I'm doing and choose what I'm doing. Now, it's true that you could say that I wanted to hurt someone, but I actually ended up helping them, right? You could say that would be a just act incidentally, but it's not a just act. It wasn't a just act from the side of the agent, so it's not a just action for the character of the person. Now, so just actions require voluntary action, the condition of being voluntary, whereas involuntary action can result in incidental justice, right? So sometimes I can't control what I'm doing, but I act in such a way that it's a just act. For instance, I act in such a way that I maintain equality of proportion or distribution of exchange with someone, right? But I don't want to do it, but I have to do it for some reason. Now, there is a way in here, so he's sort of playing around here, so you can have just acts require you to choose, and unjust acts, do those also require you to choose, right? And he gives this case, he says, for instance, imagine a father strikes their son or they strike their daughter and they do it under compulsion. Maybe they have the gun to their head. Of course, that's not Aristotle's example. But in this is a case in which you say that the father here, who strikes his daughter, has done something unjust, right? But incidentally, right? Because they had a gun to their head, they had no choice. And so in that regard, you could say that the father is not an unjust person, but the father has acted in an unjust way. But we wouldn't hold them accountable, right? We would say that's what Aristotle distinguishes as incidental injustice, right? So then Aristotle sort of discusses, he says, okay, well, now that we're talking about the way in which people get injured incidentally, well, what are the different kinds of injury that can happen in transaction? And Aristotle identifies three of them. First is people can act in such a way that eventually they do commit an incidental injustice, but it's the result of ignorance. The example he gives is soldiers who accidentally shoot down other soldiers, friendly fire cases. So you just make a mistake. So that's an incidental injustice, and you wouldn't hold someone accountable. You wouldn't say they're an unjust person. So you have mistakes. Number two, you have misadventures. And a misadventure is when you act in such a way but the results of your action are completely contrary to the most reasonable expectations, and you actually create a total huge amount of harm, but you didn't mean to do it at all, and you expected quite reasonably for something else to occur. This is a misadventure, and also in this sort of injury, we wouldn't hold the person as being accountable in terms of having committed injustice per se. Now, there is another type of injustice, though, and this is when someone acts with knowledge, but they don't act out of deliberation. That is, they know what they're doing, but they're not deliberating and reasonably thinking through how they ought to act. And this would be, for instance, I think that a good example of this would be manslaughter. You're driving your car, you run a red light, you accidentally hit and kill another person. You didn't mean to do it, right? But you acted with knowledge that you shouldn't have done it, right? But you didn't deliberate about it, and so this does seem to be a type of injustice, right? And Aristotle says that those who injure others out of choice are actually unjust and vicious. So there are some people who choose to injure other people, and this is maybe, if you will, if you're comparing it with manslaughter, you might say that's first-degree murder, right? That you purposely choose to viciously harm another person and injure someone. That's the worst kind. So there's sort of, if you will, degrees of injuries that can occur, or there's degrees of justice with regards to the sorts of injuries that can occur. Now, Aristotle raises some puzzles about justice and injustice. I'm not going to spend too much time on them. I'll leave that work for you when you go through and read the text yourself. But some of them include these questions. So, for instance, can you be voluntarily treated unjustly? That is, can you choose to get treated unjustly? Another question is all the suffering of injustice involuntary? So the flip side is it the case that every time someone suffers injustice, they do so and it's out of their control? You can see those two questions are related. In fact, in Aristotle, they're in the same sentence. The other question here is, can you voluntarily and involuntarily treat people justly? So shouldn't it be possible to choose mistreatment and injury? So these are some questions. Now, some of the possibilities he discusses is, well, number one, the incontinent person might voluntarily choose mistreatment, right? Because they can't control themselves. Here, for instance, you can think about people who have, people who have pleasure out of cutting themselves. You've heard that before, right? This may be the case that the person who does that is actually incontinent. That is, they can't control themselves. Right, so he does think that, but he says that if a person can control themselves, why would one choose mistreatment? Well, I guess if that was a case of injuring oneself, so that's a special case for Aristotle. Bad example on my part. But let's say, for instance, I choose someone else to cut me, right, and I get pleasure out of it. That would seem to be a case of incontinence, rather than a sort of voluntary choice. Part of it is, remember, for Aristotle, happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, but the soul is rational. So ultimately, all this stuff requires rational deliberation. I mean, the incontinent person generally doesn't do that, is one of the striking features of the incontinent person. But sometimes they do, they can. But there's another question. But what about in cases where a person is given more than their share of something? Is the problem with the one who assigned the share or the one who holds the excessive share? So imagine, for instance, you go to the grocery store, you buy something, the person gives you, on purpose, they choose to do this, but they give you $20 more change than you're supposed to have, right? maybe your house just burned down, and the people who work there know that, and so they give you more of your change than you're supposed to have, right? That's a breach of proportionate transaction, right? So who's the problem with? Does the injustice lie with the person who gives too much, or does the injustice lie with the person who receives too much? And you can see it's not exactly clear. But Aristotle does say, he goes on to say, well, quote, whoops. Men think that acting unjustly is in their power, and therefore that being just is easy, but it's not. To lie with one's neighbor's wife, to wound another, to deliver a bribe is easy and it is in our power, but to do these things as a result of a certain state of character is neither easy nor in our power. Aristotle is showing his cards here as he begins to discuss these problems, which is namely that he thinks that most people it's very difficult for them to actually act unjustly, because most people develop characters in which they respect the law, and they develop characters because the only way to be happy is to gain a certain form of character of justice and honesty and so forth, right? So as people pursue happy, they cultivate characters which should, at least by nature, be implicitly hostile to injustice. So that doesn't, now it's easy to go out and do the unjust things, but to have this sort of character that leads you to do those things is not actually as easy as you think. And so this is sort of an interesting thing. He also goes on to say, which I find very interesting and provocative, he says, just acts occur between people who participate in things that are good in themselves and can have too much or too little of them. Now, for some beings, for example, presumably the gods, cannot have too much of them, and to others, but those who are incurably bad, not even the smallest share in them is beneficial, but all such goods are harmful. While to others, they are beneficial up to a point. Therefore, justice is essentially something human. Now, this last phrase is the most striking part, but notice where he begins by talking about there. He notices that just actions occur between people who participate in things that are good in themselves. Happiness is something that is good in itself, right? And things that are valued for their own sake. But people who, and he says, for instance, the gods, love things for their own sake. But humans can't always love things for their own sake. Humans love things for their own sake too, but we also love things which are for the sake of other things, right? And so he says that there's a sense in which justice, at least the justice he's discussing here, ultimately corresponds here with our human condition, our natural human condition. And he does discuss some of those other puzzles and questions, but I'll leave them to you. Some of it he does talk about here in this next section. Now in section 10, he discusses the equitable, or it gets labeled as decency. I don't think that's really a good translation, but that is what the Hackett version subtitles this section. Now, what does he talk about here? Well, number one, not all things can be legislated by the law, right? You can't legislate everything because there are cases in which, number one, the law is simply incomplete, or the law has been is simplified, or there are other cases in which the law has just never arisen, in which there was no need ever arose in which you had to adjust the law to a specific case in a certain way. Think here about the stock market crash of 2008 within the United States and around the world. There, for the most part, companies were acting legally when they were buying their default derivative swaps and all that kind of stuff, right? There was no laws governing that practice. So not everything can be legislated. And so what happens when there is no law? What principle picks up the pieces in order to ensure justice? And his answer is the notion of equity. And the notion of equality, right, being this key condition. It's the notion of equity, and that the equitable should guide people in making just actions. So for instance, when a thing is indefinite, then it has to be ruled in an indefinite manner. And so this principle of equity, this sort of case-by-case basis based on equity, seems to be what he argues for. And this is why he says, for instance, not everything can be a consequence of law, but some things by decree. I've completely misspelled decree there. Now, he talks about decree, and of course he's thinking about a decree by the ruling class, the aristocrats, or a king or something like this. We might think of a decree today in terms of an executive action or a regulation or something like that, right? And this is important. For instance, you can if you live, for instance, in the United States, you can't expect Congress to come up with all the specific rules that govern the use of toxic chemical waste, for instance, right? Those things are left up to experts who actually know how to do them. And and the thing is, how you deal with toxic chemicals depends upon certain situations, depends on the chemical, so on and so forth. It's indefinite. And so you need regulations to conform to that indefiniteness. So you can see here is that political justice, if you're going to think about it in terms of the law, functions through a principle of equity into sort of trying to figure out more case-by-case basis. Now, ultimately, though, in terms of decency, he applies this to the person, right? He says, quote, "It's also evident from this who the equitable man is. The man who chooses and does such acts, and is no stickler for justice in a bad sense, but tends to take less than his share, though he has the law on his side, is equitable. And this state is equity, which is a sort of justice, and it's not a different state from justice." So there's this notion that the decency of a person is based upon their equitable relations and the equitable conditions of their actions. Okay, now the last section here before the end of Book 5 is the question of, can one commit injustice to oneself? And he doesn't ask this directly, but it's clearly implied, for instance, which is, should suicide be illegal? That is it wrong to commit suicide, for instance? Is it wrong to harm yourself? And what's the law's status? And he has sort of two answers to this. The first one here is, just to answer this, is that in harming oneself, a person suffers voluntarily, but they do not act unjustly in a voluntary way. We're going to see here in just a moment that Aristotle denies that it's possible to commit voluntary injustice, right? And part of it is because to be voluntary, you have to choose and deliberate, and you have to choose and deliberate based upon reason. Reason should not lead you into a deliberation of an unjust act, right? And there's a question of whether or not that's really the case, but that's Aristotle's view, we'll see. But you can see here is that what his ultimate view is, should suicide be illegal? And the answer is yes. Suicide's wrong because the state loses a certain share of civil rights in the loss of an individual. Therefore, injustice to oneself is a harm against the state. So in other words, when you have a state, the state's power and wealth ultimately resides in its citizens and in the ability of its citizens to act justly. So the happiness of a state depends upon the pursuit of happiness for the individuals as well. But you can see here is that when you lose an individual, the state loses a part of its substance. He doesn't say that, but I think he would agree with it. The state loses some share of its substance. It loses some share of its rights and its abilities and its duties. And in that sense, the state is what's injured. So you can say that suicide should be illegal, or harming yourself or committing injustice to yourself should be illegal, but illegal for a social reason. Illegal for the reason of the other rather than the individual. But conversely, right, what Aristotle says is that you can't commit an unjust voluntarily upon yourself. And so in a certain way, when you harm yourself, you're not committing an injustice for yourself, right? It's only an injustice with regards to the state, the other. Not the self, but the other. He says, quote, "No one acts unjustly without committing particular acts of injustice, but no one can commit adultery with his own wife, or housebreaking on his own house, or theft of his own property," right? You can't steal your own property. You can't destroy your own house. You can't commit adultery with your own lover, right? Ultimately, with your own wife or husband. I guess lover is the problem there. But you can see here is that it doesn't make sense, therefore, to say you can commit an injustice to yourself because you've done so voluntarily. His view is that you voluntarily endure suffering, but that's not the same as voluntarily committing injustice. And of course, think here, most people who do commit harm against themselves, right, they say that they're in pain, right? And so they have reasons, so they don't see it as injustice, in fact. Anyway, so that's his view on suicide and whether or not you can harm yourselves. And that really completes the picture here of Aristotle's conception of justice in the Nicomachean Ethics. In our next video, we'll take a look at Book 6, so join us for that one, which will be coming up here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you guys online.